All right, good morning, government students. On our first day with our new online schedule. So let's go ahead and get started right into Lower Federal Courts Part 3. So go ahead and pull up your notes if you have not done so already. So let's do that. All right, Lower Federal Courts Part 3. We're going to do Part 3 and then we'll do the Supreme Court. So we're going to completely finish our Judicial Branch notes today. All right, so first question. Who do presidents favor for judges? So remember, the president is the one who appoints the federal judges. And so the president wants someone who belongs to their political party. Now, remember what we talked about yesterday, that judges aren't necessarily officially associated with a political party, but you are able to look at how a judge is ruled in the past and kind of make a determination about what kind of ideologies, what kind of beliefs that they have. And so a president will often have usually a team of people look into judges' pasts and see who are the more conservative judges or who are the more liberal judges, who are the strict constitutionalists, who are the interpretists, and how can we choose someone who believes similarly to the president. So that's who they're usually going to choose, someone who believes in like they do. So when is it more likely for Congress to create more judgeships? So remember, since the president is the one who is appointing these judges, Congress will create more positions for judges, like they did for Kennedy, when the president and Congress are of the same political party. So if Congress is Democratic and the president is a Democrat, or Republican and Republican, that way, as they add more judges, they know the president is going to pick people who have similar beliefs as them. So I ask the question, why do you think that is right there? Because Congress is more willing to create more judges when they know the president will select judges matching their political party. All right, remember, if this is going too fast, go ahead and hit pause so you can finish filling that out. What is a senatorial courtesy system? We talked about that yesterday. It's a system in which the president submits the name of the judicial candidate to the senators from the candidate's state before submitting it to the formal Senate approval. So again, if we were going to create, or if the president was going to appoint Judge Dougie Nuggets to the Supreme Court, well, the president would go to Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown, who are two senators from Ohio, and ask them, what do you think about Dougie Nuggets? Do you think he's a good candidate? How's his history? All this stuff. And once our two senators from Ohio approve him, then it would go to the Senate as a full vote. So what happens if either of them or both senators oppose the nominee selected by the president? Then the president usually withdraws the name and nominates another candidate. So if Rob Portman says, nope, Dougie Nuggets is not conservative enough, we think he has a bad history of making too many interpretations of the Constitution and not strictly sticking to it, then they wouldn't approve of him, or Rob Portman wouldn't approve of him, and the president would move on and find another candidate. All right. What are some of the likely background traits or other experiences of federal judges? So, historically, judges have had legal training. They have held a variety of positions in law or government. Many of them served as state court judges before becoming federal judges. And until recently, very few had been women or minorities. So, like most of the other things we've been learning about in government and history, usually middle-aged white men or older white men, and educated, well-off men at that. Now, fortunately, more contemporary times, we've got more women in those positions, more minorities in those positions, so much so that presidents have tried to intentionally diversify the Supreme Court a little bit. So who was the first African-American Supreme Court judge? That was Thurgood Marshall. That'll definitely be a question on your test, so make sure you know these next two names. So first African-American Supreme Court judge is Thurgood Marshall. Who was the first female Supreme Court judge? That was Sandra Day O'Connor. Sandra Day O'Connor. All right, so we're going to go to the next section of notes. These notes are going to look a little bit different on your note sheet there. You're going to have to type in a lot more. You're going to have full sentences to type in rather than just individual words. So remember, if you need me to go a little bit slower, just go ahead and hit pause, finish typing it before you hit play again. All right, the introduction section. The Supreme Court is the court of last resort for all questions of the federal law. Once something has made its way to the Supreme Court, that is the last stop. There's no court, there's no trial, there's nothing after the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not required to hear all cases presented to it, and instead carefully chooses which cases to rule on. The Supreme Court gets thousands of cases petitioned to be a part of the Supreme Court every year. And because they can't literally spend the time to do all thousands of these cases, they pick and choose a handful of them that they feel like are most important to be ruled on at this time. Because whatever it is that the Supreme Court rules on that case sets the precedent for all other courts, all other laws in the country. So their decisions are really big. And so they make sure they try to pick the ones that are most representative of what needs to be done at that time. Most Supreme Court cases are appeals from lower courts. So people have, from lower courts, decided they don't like the way the ruling went, and so they've appealed up to the Supreme Court. And as we said a minute ago, Supreme Court decisions are binding for all lower courts. So whatever the Supreme Court rules, then every court under that has to just go with it because this is the final say. It'd be like if Mr. Aaron gave you a restricted lunch. You got in trouble in my class. And you said, well, that's not fair. I'm going to go to Mr. Eddie and appeal to him. Then Mr. Eddie says, nope, I agree. Well, there is authorities higher than Mr. Eddie, so maybe you could go to Miss Nikki or Dr. Becky, and you don't agree with them. Then maybe you could go to the board of directors, who's even higher than them. But then at some point, you're going to get to that top level, which for our national governments, our Supreme Court. And once they make the ruling, then there's nowhere else to go. And whatever they decide is binding for everything else. All right, the next section, the jurisdiction section. The Supreme Court has both appellate and original jurisdiction. So the majority of the cases the Supreme Court hears are appeals from lower courts, but they can potentially hear some original jurisdiction cases. So if they can be both hearing appeals and be the first ones to hear certain cases. The Supreme Court has original jurisdiction when foreign governments or U.S. states are a party or one of the plaintiffs, or litigants, one of the litigants in it. So if you want to sue the state of Ohio for something, then the Supreme Court can have original jurisdiction over that. All right, so still down here in the justices part, the Supreme Court has 9 justices or judges, the Chief Justice and 8 associate justices. Now, when a Supreme Court justice retires or passes away, then the president then appoints a new person to be approved of for the Senate, and then they get to join the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, which is what happened a few years ago, and Barack Obama's last year's president, he nominated someone, and the Senate decided, at the time it was a Republican-controlled Senate, so there were politics being played. The Senate decided that they didn't think it was appropriate for a judge to appoint someone in the president's final year of his office. So they did not approve of any Supreme Court justice. So there was 8 rather than 9 Supreme Court justices for that year. So usually you would want there to be an odd number, so you could have 5 against 4. But we actually had some 4 against 4 decisions at that time. And when that happens, it just goes whatever the previous case had determined, it sticks with that. So Congress has the power to set or change this number. It's been 9 justices since 1869. Um, FDR threatened to add more, but that has not happened in 150, 161 years. 51 years. Math. Supreme Court justices can be impeached like all other federal officers. So just like a president or a Congress member can be impeached, Supreme Court justices can also. The Constitution does not describe the duties of the justices. Instead, the duties have developed over time through law and tradition. So, what the Supreme Court members do and how they do their job has just kind of evolved through tradition and based on laws that have been set. So, the Constitution doesn't say they're going to do this and do it this way. No, that was kind of left up to how Congress over time thought the job should be done, and how the judges themselves thought the job should be done. The main duty of Supreme Court justices is to hear and rule on cases. So they have 3 tasks. First, they have to decide which cases to hear. Remember, I said there's going to be thousands of cases that they could potentially choose from, but they choose which select few they want to hear and listen to. Then they decide on the case. So, case comes to them, they choose, yep, that's a good one, and then they make a ruling on that case. And then third, they need to give an explanation for that decision. They call those the court opinion. So we have a majority opinion, which is the winning side, and the minority decision, which is the losing side. And justices will write an explanation for both sides. And those can be really important and interesting letters written if you want to understand law and understand why the Supreme Court justices ruled in the way they did. That's what they try to outline when they write out their papers, write out their opinions after those cases. Justices are expected to maintain objectivity, so they are careful to not be involved in business or other situations outside of the court. So ideally, your Supreme Court justices are not going to be running Microsoft or have a bunch of stock in Apple, because then they can potentially be swayed in some way or have some sort of outside influence that would affect their decision making. So you don't want them to already be in some sort of office position or involved politically or in a business outside of just making their court decisions. Justices have historically been men, and it was not until recently that there were women on the bench. So literally talked about Sandra Day O'Connor. Then we got the notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We've had Sotomayor, who was the most recent woman added to the court by Barack Obama. She was the first Latina on the court. So not a lot of women throughout history, but hopefully we'll see that more as a trend as more women get on the bench. Most judges have had law degrees and have a lot of law experience. Most judges have been historically white, educated, upper-class men. And it is not required, but most have been American-born. There's been very few that have been non-American born. And actually, the majority of the ones who have not been were appointed by George Washington. So kind of hard to argue the American-born part when America didn't exist yet. All right. And talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there's a little picture of her down here. All right, so the appointing section. Presidents appoint judges. All federal judges are appointed by the president. Then they must be approved by the Senate. Now, this has been repeated over and over again. Probably means it'll likely be on your test. Typically, presidents appoint judges who are expected to rule in a way the president's party would approve of. Also, something we've talked about over and over again. Republican president is likely to appoint a more conservative Republican leaning judge. All right. That is the last part for our notes. So after this, we'll just be working on our study guide and getting ready for our judicial branch test. I hope you guys are having a great day today. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Miss you all, and I will talk to you soon.